Sometimes life has a way of making you feel worthless, like everything you touch turns to dust in your hands. Amos Beckett knew that feeling well as he stood in his failing farmyard, watching his neighbors whisper about his drinking and his mounting debts. In the harsh Montana territory of 1881, a desperate farmer made what everyone called the worst trade in frontier history. Amos Beckett, drowning his sorrows in whiskey before the sun reached its peak, handed over his stubborn old donkey to a quiet cowboy named Silas Kearney for nothing more than a bottle of spirits. The whole town of Copper Falls had a good laugh at the fool's bargain. What they didn't know was that Silas had spotted something special about that ornery animal, something that would soon prove invaluable when a U.S. Army payroll stagecoach disappeared into the wilderness. While ruthless outlaws celebrated their biggest heist yet, Silas and his new four-legged partner were about to embark on a journey that would test every ounce of courage they possessed. But what could a washed-up cowboy and a worthless donkey possibly do against the most dangerous gang in the territory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Falls, Montana territory, where the sound of hammering echoed from the blacksmith's forge and the gentle lowing of cattle drifted on the crisp October air. In 1881, this was still frontier country, where a man's word meant everything and his reputation could make or break his livelihood. For Amos Beckett, both had been shattered 3 years ago when his wife Martha died of fever, leaving him alone with a small farm, a stubborn donkey, and grief that seemed to swallow him whole. The donkey stood in the corner of his ramshackle barn, ears drooping with what looked like resignation. Amos had named her Penny when Martha first brought the animal home, claiming she'd won it in a card game from some drifters passing through. That had been Martha's way, always spinning tales, always making the ordinary seem like an adventure. The donkey had been different then, alert and spirited, following Martha around the farm like a devoted dog. Now, 3 years later, Penny seemed as broken as her owner, standing motionless for hours, only moving when hunger or thirst demanded it. "You're about as useful as I am," Amos muttered to the animal as he kicked at the empty grain bucket. His words slurred slightly evidence of his early morning ritual with the bottle he kept hidden in the coffee tin where Martha used to store her wedding ring. The ring was still there, a small gold band that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. He couldn't bear to look at it, but he couldn't bear to move it either. The farm reflected his state of mind. Once proud fences sagged under neglect, the vegetable garden had surrendered to weeds, and the barn roof leaked in at least 3 places. His neighbors, decent folks who'd tried to help in the early days, had given up their offers of assistance when it became clear that Amos preferred drowning his sorrows to accepting charity. Now they crossed the street when they saw him coming, whispering about the broken man who'd let drink destroy everything his beloved Martha had built. Thomas Ainsworth, who ran the general store, had stopped extending credit 6 months ago. "I'm sorry, Amos," he'd said, not meeting his eyes. "My wife says it's throwing good money after bad." The banker, a thin man named Crenshaw with wire-rimmed spectacles and a permanent frown, had been less kind. The foreclosure notice sat on Amos's kitchen table, creased from his anxious handling. 30 days to pay what he owed or lose everything. It was Tuesday morning when the stranger rode into town. Silas Kearney sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, straight-backed and easy, his weathered hands loose on the reins. He wore the kind of clothes that marked him as a working cowboy, sturdy denim pants, a cotton shirt faded from many washings, and a hat that had seen better days but was shaped perfectly to his head. His boots were good leather, well-maintained but showing honest wear. Nothing fancy, nothing that would mark him as either wealthy or destitute, just a man who knew his business and went about it quietly. What caught attention wasn't his appearance. The territory was full of men who looked much the same, but the way he moved, the way his eyes took in everything without seeming to look at anything in particular. When he dismounted at Patterson's saloon, he didn't throw his reins over the hitching post like most men. Instead, he secured them with a practiced motion that spoke of long experience with horses that might need to move quickly. Martha Patterson, who ran the saloon with her husband Eddie, served him coffee instead of whiskey, though he hadn't asked for either specifically. "You look like a coffee man," she said, with the kind of smile that had kept the establishment friendly, even when tempers ran hot. Silas nodded his thanks and sipped the brew thoughtfully, listening to the conversations around him without appearing to eavesdrop. "That Breckett's going to lose his place," someone was saying. "Damned shame, but a man's got to pull his weight." "Martha was the backbone of that operation," another voice added. "Amos never had the sand for farming. Good woman wasted on a weak man, if you ask me." Silas said nothing, but his eyes found the window that offered a view of the Breckett place down the street. Even from a distance, the neglect was evident. What interested him more was the donkey he could see standing in the yard, motionless as a statue. After finishing his coffee, Silas made his way through town with the unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere special to be. He stopped at Ainsworth's store for supplies, nothing unusual, just coffee, beans, and hardtack, but he listened to the conversation between Ainsworth and his wife about the sad situation with Amos Breckett. "I heard tell he's been drinking since sunrise," Mrs. Ainsworth whispered, though her version of a whisper carried clearly across the store. Poor Martha would roll over in her grave. "The man needs help," Ainsworth replied, but his tone suggested he didn't think help would be welcome or effective. Silas paid for his supplies and stepped back into the morning air. The October sun was climbing higher, promising another warm day, before the mountain winter settled in for good. He walked slowly toward the Breckett place, taking in the details that others might miss the way. The barn door hung slightly askew, the path worn from house to barn that showed someone still maintained a routine. The fact that despite the overall neglect, the animals looked fed and watered. As he approached, he could see Amos through the open barn door, sitting on an overturned bucket, talking to the donkey in the rambling way of a man who'd been drinking. But there was something in the way the animal positioned itself, ears forward despite its apparent lethargy, that caught Silas's attention. This wasn't just any ordinary farm donkey. Most people saw what they expected to see, a broken-down drunk and his equally worthless animal. But Silas had spent years learning to look beyond appearances, to see the potential in what others dismissed. The donkey's stance, the alertness in its eyes despite its drooping posture, the way it seemed to catalogue every sound and movement around it. These were the traits of an animal with unusual intelligence and training. He'd seen animals like this before, in places where such skills meant the difference between life and death. The question was, how had such a creature ended up on a failing farm in Copper Falls, Montana Territory? And more importantly, what was Amos Breckett planning to do with it? From his coat pocket, Silas withdrew a bottle of whiskey he'd purchased at Patterson's, not the cheap rotgut that most cowboys drank, but a decent bottle that would catch a desperate man's attention. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the simplest approach was the most effective. As he walked up the rutted path toward the barn, he could hear Amos's voice more clearly. "Told me you were special, but special don't pay the bills, does it? Special don't keep a man from losing everything he cares about." The donkey's ears swiveled toward Silas's approach before Amos noticed him. When the farmer finally looked up, his bloodshot eyes took a moment to focus on the stranger standing in his doorway. "Help you with something?" Amos's voice carried the careful politeness of a man trying to hide how drunk he was. "Maybe we can help each other," Silas said quietly, holding up the bottle so the morning light caught the amber liquid inside. "I've got this, and I'm thinking you might have something I need." Amos's eyes fixed on the whiskey with the intensity of a starving man looking at a feast. "What would that be?" Silas nodded toward the donkey. "That animal there. I'd like to make you an offer for it." The laughter that escaped Amos was bitter and sharp. "Penny? You want to buy Penny?" He gestured toward the donkey with a sweep of his arm that nearly cost him his balance. "Mister, that's the most worthless animal in the territory. Won't pull a plow, won't carry a pack, stubborn as sin and twice as useless." "Maybe," Silas said, "but I've got a feeling about her." The bottle seemed to glow in his hands, a promise of temporary escape from the pain that had been eating at Amos for 3 long years. He looked from the whiskey to the donkey and back again, weighing a lifetime of memories against the immediate need to forget. "Straight trade?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Straight trade," Silas confirmed. And in that moment, as the Montana sun climbed toward its peak and cast sharp shadows across the dusty ground, the fate of 3 lives, 2 human and 1 decidedly not, hung in the balance of a bargain that would seem, to anyone watching, like the most foolish transaction in frontier history. Neither man could know that this simple exchange would soon lead them into a confrontation with the most dangerous outlaws in the territory, or that the worthless donkey would prove to be the key to saving not just their lives, but the lives of others as well. The morning air carried the scent of coming winter and distant possibilities. While somewhere in the mountains beyond Copper Falls, ruthless men counted stolen gold and planned their escape, unaware that their plans were about to be challenged by the most unlikely partnership the frontier had ever seen. The handshake that sealed their bargain felt like the end of everything to Amos Breckett. His palm was damp with sweat and shame as he clasped the stranger's firm grip, trading away the last living connection to his Martha for a bottle of temporary oblivion. The whiskey felt heavier than it should have as Silas pressed it into his trembling hands. "She's all yours," Amos mumbled, unable to meet the donkey's eyes. Penny stood perfectly still, as if she understood the magnitude of what was happening. Her ears twitched once, a small movement that seemed to hold more dignity than Amos felt he possessed. Silas Kearney moved with practiced efficiency, producing a worn leather halter from his saddlebags with the ease of a man who'd done this many times before. The saddlebags themselves were interesting scarred leather that spoke of hard use, but well-maintained, with buckles that gleamed despite their age. As he approached Penny, his movements were calm and deliberate, the kind of patience that came from working with animals that had reasons to be wary. "Easy, girl," Silas murmured, his voice pitched low and soothing. To Amos's amazement, the donkey that had been stubborn and uncooperative for 3 years stepped forward willingly, lowering her head to accept the halter. "That's it. We're going to get along just fine." By now, word of the strange transaction had spread through Copper Falls with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Thomas Ainsworth appeared at the edge of the property, drawn by curiosity and the kind of morbid fascination that made people slow down to stare at accidents. Mrs. Henley from the boarding house had found an excuse to sweep her front porch, positioning herself for the best view of the proceedings. "Well, I'll be damned," Ainsworth said to anyone within earshot. "Amos actually found someone fool enough to take that animal off his hands." The comment stung, but not as much as Amos had expected. The whiskey bottle provided a different kind of weight in his hands, a promise that the pain would recede, at least for a while. He twisted off the cork and took a long pull, feeling the burn of decent liquor better than anything he'd tasted in months. Silas was running his hands along Penny's flanks and legs with the practiced touch of someone who knew how to evaluate livestock. What he found seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded to himself and murmured something that sounded approving. The donkey stood perfectly still for the examination, occasionally turning her head to study this new human with intelligent brown eyes. "You planning to use her for pack work?" Amos asked, genuine curiosity cutting through his alcoholic haze. Part of him, a part he tried to suppress, wanted to know that Penny would be treated well. "Something like that," Silas replied, checking the donkey's hooves with the same methodical care. "She looks like she's got good bone structure, strong back, might be more useful than folks think." The words carried an odd note that Amos couldn't quite place, as if Silas was speaking about more than just the animal's physical attributes. But before he could pursue the thought, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention toward the main road. 3 riders were approaching at a hard gallop, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. The lead rider wore the blue uniform of the U.S. Army, and the urgency of their approach sent a ripple of tension through the gathering crowd. By the time they reached the center of town, half of Copper Falls had emerged from buildings and side streets to see what the commotion was about. Anyone seen unusual riders passing through in the last day or two? The sergeant called out, his voice carrying the authority of military training and barely controlled anger. 3 or 4 men, heavily armed, riding hard toward the mountains. Thomas Ainsworth stepped forward, appointed himself spokesman by virtue of owning the largest store. "What's this about, Sergeant?" "Army payroll wagon was hit yesterday morning, 20 miles east of here. 4 good men dead and $15,000 in gold missing." The sergeant's jaw worked, as if he were chewing something bitter. "The Carmichael brothers and their gang, from what we can tell. Tracks lead this way." The name sent a collective shudder through the crowd. Everyone in the territory had heard of the Carmichael gang, 3 brothers and their associates who had been terrorizing stagecoaches and settlements from Colorado to Canada. They were known for their brutality as much as their efficiency, leaving no witnesses and taking no prisoners. $15,000, someone whispered. "That's more money than this whole town sees in a year." "It's more than that," the sergeant continued grimly. "That payroll was meant for Fort Patterson. 3 months' wages for 200 men, most of them with families. There are wives and children who won't eat this winter if we don't recover that gold." Silas had gone very still during this exchange, his hands resting calmly on Penny's neck, but Amos noticed the change in him. The easy-going cowboy had been replaced by something harder, more focused. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, the tone of a man accustomed to making decisions in dangerous situations. "Which direction did the tracks lead?" Silas asked. The sergeant looked him over, taking in the worn but quality clothing, the way he sat his horse, the quiet competence that seemed to surround him. "Northwest, toward Devil's Canyon." "Why?" "I might be able to help with the tracking." "You?" The sergeant's eyebrows rose. "No offense, mister, but we're dealing with the most dangerous gang in the territory. This isn't work for civilians." "I've done some tracking in my time," Silas said mildly, "and I know these mountains better than most." That was news to Amos, who thought he knew every man within 50 miles of Copper Falls, but there was something about Silas's quiet confidence that made the claim believable. The sergeant seemed to sense it too, because his dismissive expression shifted to one of cautious interest. "You have any military experience?" "Some," Silas said, offering nothing more. The sergeant studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We can use all the help we can get. The trail's getting cold, and we lost 2 men to an ambush when we got too close yesterday. They know we're coming." "What makes you think you'll have better luck this time?" Mrs. Henley called out, her voice shrill with the kind of fear that made people ask uncomfortable questions. "Because this time we'll be tracking them properly," Silas said, his hand moving to rest on Penny's neck. "Sometimes the best tracker isn't human." The crowd exchanged glances, not understanding what he meant, but Amos felt something cold settle in his stomach. There had always been something different about Penny, something that Martha had hinted at but never fully explained. The way the animal seemed to know things, to sense danger before it appeared, to find paths through terrain that looked impassable. "You're talking about using that old donkey?" Ainsworth's voice cracked with disbelief. "Silas, I know you just traded good whiskey for her, but—" "She'll do," Silas cut him off gently. "Trust me on this one." As if responding to some silent signal, Penny lifted her head and turned toward the mountains, her ears pricked forward with an alertness that hadn't been there moments before. She stood perfectly still for several heartbeats, then took 3 deliberate steps in the direction the sergeant had indicated, stopping to look back at Silas as if to say, "Well, are we going or not?" The gesture sent a murmur through the crowd, because everyone could see that this wasn't the same listless animal that had stood in Amos's yard for 3 years. Something had awakened in her, something that spoke of purpose and capability. "I'll be damned," the sergeant said softly. "She does seem to know something, doesn't she?" Amos took another long pull from his bottle, but the whiskey couldn't wash away the growing certainty that he had just traded away something far more valuable than he'd realized. As he watched Silas make final preparations for departure, checking his gear with military precision, he began to understand that this quiet cowboy was much more than he appeared to be. The morning sun was climbing toward its peak when Silas swung into his saddle and gathered Penny's lead rope. The donkey fell into step beside his horse, with the easy grace of an animal that had done this many times before, and Amos felt his heart break a little more as he realized how wrong he'd been about so many things. "You take care of her," he called out, surprising himself with the words. Silas touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. "She'll be in good hands," he said, and somehow Amos believed him. As the small party rode toward the mountains, Silas, the 3 soldiers, and one supposedly worthless donkey, the crowd slowly dispersed, returning to their daily routines, but carrying with them the knowledge that something significant had just begun. They had witnessed what appeared to be the most foolish trade in frontier history, followed immediately by what might prove to be either a rescue mission or a suicide run. Only Amos remained in his yard, bottle in hand, watching until the riders disappeared into the distance. For the first time in 3 years, he found himself hoping that he was wrong about the donkey, wrong about the trade, wrong about everything. Because if Silas was right about Penny's capabilities, then Martha's last gift to him might just save more lives than his poor choices had cost. The empty bottle slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hard-packed earth. But for once, the sound of breaking glass didn't make him think of his own failures. Instead, he found himself remembering Martha's voice, speaking words she'd said years ago. "Sometimes, Amos, the most valuable things come disguised as the most ordinary. You just have to know how to look." As the echoes of hoofbeats faded into the mountain silence, Amos Beckett walked slowly back toward his house, leaving behind the shards of glass and perhaps, just perhaps, the first pieces of his broken life. The morning air grew thinner as Silas and the army patrol climbed into the foothills, following a trail that seemed to disappear and reappear like smoke. Sergeant Morrison, the lead soldier, had filled in the grim details of the attack as they rode. The payroll wagon had been traveling with an escort of 6 men when the Carmichael gang struck at dawn, using the terrain to their advantage and showing a knowledge of army movements that suggested inside information. "They knew exactly where we'd be," Morrison said, his weathered face grim beneath his campaign hat. "Hit us at the narrowest part of Willow Creek Canyon, where we couldn't maneuver or retreat. Professional work, if you can call murder professional." Penny moved alongside Silas's horse with an easy gait that belied her years, her small hooves finding secure footing on ground that made the army mount step carefully. More than once, Silas noticed the donkey's ears swivel toward sounds the humans couldn't hear, or the way she would stop and test the air with her sensitive nostrils before proceeding. "Your animal seems to know these trails," observed Corporal Hayes, the youngest of the 3 soldiers. He had the kind of fair complexion that burned easily in the mountain sun, and nervous eyes that darted constantly between the rocky outcrops that could hide a sniper. "She's traveled them before," Silas said simply, which was the truth, though not the whole truth. He was beginning to understand that Martha Beckett had been much more than the simple farm wife everyone believed her to be. The payroll manifest that Sergeant Morrison carried told a story that went beyond mere dollars and cents. 15,000 in gold coins, carefully counted and recorded, meant to support the families of soldiers stationed at one of the territory's most isolated outposts. Fort Patterson sat astride one of the few reliable passes through the mountains, making it strategically vital but supply-dependent. Without their wages, those families would face a winter of genuine hardship. "Most of these boys signed up to send money home," Morrison explained when Silas asked about the stakes. "My own wife's expecting our second child. That gold represents food on tables, roofs over heads, medicine for sick children. The Carmichaels might as well have robbed a church." As they climbed higher, the October sun did little to warm the air, and patches of early snow appeared in the shadows between rocks. Penny's behavior became increasingly focused, pausing at certain spots to examine the ground or lift her head to catch scents carried on the wind. At one such stop, she led them off the main trail to a small clearing where the remains of a campfire were barely visible beneath a thin layer of wind-blown leaves. "Cold for at least 2 days," said Private Rodriguez, the third soldier, as he knelt to examine the ashes. "But someone was here, and they weren't being careful about hiding it." Silas dismounted and walked the perimeter of the camp, reading signs that the soldiers missed. Boot prints in the soft earth, the way branches had been broken for firewood, the careful arrangement of stones around the fire pit, all spoke of experienced outdoorsmen who felt secure enough to take basic precautions, but not desperate enough to hide their presence completely. 4 men, he announced after completing his survey. They stayed one night, cooked meat, and felt safe enough to let their horses graze freely. They're confident, which makes them dangerous, but it also makes them predictable. Penny had wandered to the far edge of the clearing, where she stood with her head raised, perfectly still except for the slight movement of her nostrils as she tested the air. When Silas approached, she took several steps toward a gap between 2 large boulders that wasn't immediately visible from where they'd entered the clearing. "She's found something," Morrison observed, following Silas toward the donkey. Beyond the boulders lay another trail, this one so well concealed that even Silas might have missed it without Penny's guidance. It angled steeply upward, threading between rocky outcrops that would provide excellent cover for anyone who knew how to use them. More importantly, it headed in a direction that would eventually circle back toward the main pass, allowing the outlaws to watch for pursuit while planning their next move. "Clever," Morrison admitted grudgingly. "They're not just running blind, they've got a destination in mind, and they're using the terrain to control who can follow them." As they prepared to take the hidden trail, Silas noticed Corporal Hayes studying Penny with undisguised curiosity. The young soldier had grown up on a farm before joining the army and had an eye for livestock. "That's not an ordinary donkey," Hayes said quietly. "The way she moves, the way she reads the ground, I've never seen an animal like her." "What do you mean?" Silas asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Well, sir, most donkeys are stubborn creatures that need coaxing to do anything beyond the basics. But she's been leading us as much as following. Look at how she positions herself always where she can see the back trail, always checking the wind, always alert for danger. That's the behavior of an animal that's been trained for specific work." The observation was astute, and it confirmed Silas's growing suspicions about Martha Brackett's past. Penny wasn't just an unusually intelligent animal. She was an animal that had been trained by professionals for work that required survival skills and tactical awareness. As they followed the concealed trail higher into the mountains, Silas found himself reconstructing the story in his mind. Martha had appeared in Copper Falls 7 years ago, claiming to be a widow looking for a fresh start. She'd had enough money to help Amos make a down payment on his farm, and she'd brought with her a donkey that she claimed to have won in a card game. The animal had always been different, too alert, too knowing, too capable for a simple farm beast. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made sense of many things that had seemed merely eccentric about Martha Brackett. Her knowledge of weather patterns, her ability to find lost cattle in terrain that baffled experienced ranchers, her occasional use of words and phrases that seemed to come from a different kind of life entirely. "There!" Penny stopped suddenly, her head turned toward a distant ridge. Following her gaze, Silas could make out a thin wisp of smoke rising from what appeared to be an impossible location, a vertical cliff face that should have been unclimbable. Morrison produced a pair of field glasses and studied the smoke for several minutes. "I'll be damned," he said finally. "There's a ledge up there, maybe big enough for a small camp. Natural fortress. You could hold off an army from a position like that." "How do we get up there?" Hayes asked, studying the cliff face with the kind of expression usually reserved for impossible mathematical problems. "We don't," Silas said. "At least, not the way they're expecting us to." He was thinking of the manifest again, and the implications of what they were facing. The Carmichael gang hadn't simply robbed and run. They were planning something more complex. The strategic position they'd chosen suggested they intended to hold the high ground while they dealt with the stolen gold, possibly waiting for accomplices or buyers. Penny had moved again, this time toward what looked like solid rock wall. But as Silas approached, he could see that appearances were deceiving. What seemed to be an unbroken cliff face was actually two massive stone formations with a narrow gap between them, a gap just wide enough for a man or a small animal to squeeze through. "Well, I'll be damned," Morrison said again. "She found us a back door." The hidden passage wound upward, through the heart of the rock formation, carved by centuries of water erosion and hidden from view by the angle of the surrounding cliffs. It was treacherous, going narrow ledges with drops that could kill, loose stones that could start avalanches, and several places where they had to dismount and lead their animals single file. But Penny navigated it with the confidence of familiarity, pausing at the dangerous spots to let the horses find their footing, choosing the safest path through terrain that could have been designed to kill unwary travelers. More than once, Silas caught himself wondering not just who had trained this animal, but where and for what purpose. As they climbed, the implications of the situation became clearer. The Carmichael gang hadn't chosen their position randomly. They knew about the hidden approaches, the defensive advantages, the escape routes. This was the kind of knowledge that came from experience, possibly from using this same hideout before, which raised the uncomfortable question of how Martha Brackett's donkey had come to know these secret ways. The sun was past its peak when they finally emerged onto a ledge that offered a view of the outlaw camp. Below them, hidden in a natural amphitheater carved from the living rock, 4 men sat around a small fire, their horses picketed in the shadow of an overhanging cliff. The gold from the payroll wagon was visible in wooden chests, carelessly stacked as if the outlaws had no doubt of their security. "The Carmichael brothers," Morrison whispered, studying the scene through his field glasses. "That's Jake with the black hat and Tom with the red shirt. The other 2 must be part of their gang." Silas was studying the layout with a tactical eye, noting the positions of the horses, the weapons visible near each man, the routes of approach and escape. But what caught his attention most was Penny's reaction to the scene below. The donkey had gone completely still, not with the alertness she'd shown on the trail, but with something that looked almost like recognition. "We need to plan our approach carefully," he said quietly. "These men didn't survive this long by being careless, and they've chosen their ground well." As they settled in to observe and plan, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something larger and more dangerous than a simple payroll robbery. The professional way the gang had executed the attack, their knowledge of the terrain, their confidence in this supposedly secret hideout, it all suggested connections and resources that went beyond 3 brothers and their immediate associates. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Penny, the worthless donkey, who seemed to know these mountains better than the men who lived in them, carrying secrets that her previous owner might never have suspected. The October sun continued its arc across the sky, and in the hidden camp below, 4 of the most dangerous men in the territory sat counting stolen gold, unaware that their carefully chosen sanctuary had been compromised by the very animal they might once have known. 20 miles away in Copper Falls, Amos Breckett sat at his kitchen table, staring at the foreclosure notice with eyes that had begun to clear for the first time in months. The whiskey was gone. He'd finished the bottle. Silas had given him the night before, but instead of the usual desperate craving for more, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: curiosity. The house felt different without Penny's presence. He'd grown so accustomed to the soft sounds of the donkey moving around the yard, the occasional bray that announced visitors or weather changes, that the silence seemed unnatural. But it wasn't the melancholy silence of loss he'd expected. Instead, it was the expectant quiet of something waiting to happen. Martha's belongings were still packed away in the bedroom closet, untouched since the day she died. Amos had avoided them like they were contaminated, unable to bear the memories they would bring. But now, with Penny gone and questions multiplying in his mind, he found himself standing before the closet door with his hand on the knob. The first thing he found was the cloth map, carefully folded and wrapped in oiled paper to protect it from moisture. It had been sewn by Martha's own hands. He could tell from the neat, precise stitches that characterized all her needlework. But this wasn't a decorative sampler or kitchen towel. It was a detailed representation of the mountain territory north of Copper Falls, complete with trails, landmarks, and notations in Martha's careful handwriting. As Amos spread the map on the kitchen table, he began to understand why Penny had seemed so alert when Silas mentioned the mountains. The trails marked on Martha's map weren't the well-known routes that appeared on official surveys. These were hidden paths, shortcuts through dangerous terrain and secret ways that could allow someone to move unseen through country that most people considered impassable. More disturbing were the annotations Martha had made in the margins, names of places that sounded ominous: Devil's Backbone, Blood Creek, Widow's Canyon. And scattered throughout were small symbols that seemed to indicate camps or hideouts, marked with dates going back more than 10 years. Amos sat heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of realization settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. His wife, his gentle, loving Martha, who had seemed to find joy in simple domestic pleasures, had possessed knowledge that spoke of a life far removed from farming and small-town respectability. Meanwhile, in the mountains above, Silas was discovering just how accurate Martha's hidden map would have been. The trail Penny had led them along matched exactly with what Martha had sewn into her cloth, down to the location of the outlaws' camp and the hidden approaches that made it seem impregnable. The donkey stood at the edge of their observation point, perfectly still, her attention focused on the scene below. Silas had positioned himself where he could watch both the outlaw camp and Penny's reactions, and what he saw confirmed his growing suspicions. This animal didn't just know these trails, she knew the people in that camp. "We need to get closer," Sergeant Morrison whispered, studying the layout through his field glasses. "If we can get within rifle range, we might be able to pin them down long enough to recover the gold." "That's a mistake," Silas said quietly. "Look at how they're positioned. They've got clear sight lines in every direction, and if we get pinned down on this ledge, we'll be sitting ducks. They know this ground better than we do." "Then what do you suggest?" Morrison's voice carried the frustration of a soldier who understood tactics but was facing an apparently impossible situation. Silas was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Martha's map and Penny's behavior, trying to piece together a story that made sense of everything he'd observed. "We wait until dark," he said finally, "and we use what they don't expect us to know." As if she understood his words, Penny turned and walked to a different part of the ledge, where she stood looking down at what appeared to be solid cliff face. But Silas had learned to trust the donkey's instincts, and when he joined her, he could see what she was showing him: another hidden path, this one leading directly down toward the outlaw camp from an angle that would be invisible to the sentries. "Son of a bitch," Corporal Hayes breathed when Silas pointed out the route. "How does she know about these places?" "I'm beginning to think she used to live here," Silas said, which was closer to the truth than anyone realized. The afternoon sun was casting longer shadows when one of the outlaws below rose from the fire and walked to where the horses were picketed. Silas watched through Morrison's field glasses as the man checked each animal carefully, running experienced hands along legs and backs, examining hooves and checking tack. It was the methodical examination of someone who expected to move quickly and couldn't afford to have a horse go lame at the wrong moment. "They're getting ready to move," he announced quietly, "probably planning to travel at night when it's harder to track them." "Where would they go?" Rodriguez asked. "We're already pretty far into the mountains." Silas was thinking about Martha's map, about the notations she'd made and the trails she'd marked. If his growing theory was correct, the Carmichaels weren't just hiding, they were heading for a specific destination, probably a more permanent hideout where they could wait out pursuit or divide the stolen gold. "They'll head for higher ground," he said, "somewhere they can see anyone coming from miles away, with multiple escape routes if they need them." Penny had moved again, this time to a spot where she could see the back trail they'd followed up the mountain. Her ears were pricked forward, and there was a tension in her posture that spoke of danger approaching. Silas followed her gaze and caught a glimpse of movement far below riders coming up the main trail, moving fast. "Company coming," he announced, passing the field glasses to Morrison. The sergeant studied the approaching riders for several minutes before lowering the glasses with a grim expression. "3 more men, heavily armed. Looks like the rest of the Carmichael gang." The situation had just become much more complicated. Instead of facing 4 outlaws in a defensive position, they would soon be dealing with 7 dangerous men who knew the terrain and had every advantage except surprise. "We need to move now," Morrison said, checking his rifle, "before they can reinforce the camp." "No," Silas said firmly. "That's exactly what they want us to do. Those men coming up the trail aren't reinforcements, they're beaters, driving us toward the main camp where the others can finish us." He was thinking like a soldier now, reading the tactical situation with skills he'd hoped never to use again. The Carmichaels had planned this carefully, using the stolen payroll as bait to draw army pursuit into terrain where they held every advantage. "Then what do we do?" Hayes asked, his young face pale with the realization of how badly outnumbered they were. Silas looked at Penny, who had turned away from the approaching riders and was again studying the hidden path that led down toward the camp. The donkey's behavior suggested she had her own ideas about how this situation should be handled. "We do what they don't expect," he said finally. "We trust the donkey." As the sun continued its descent toward the western peaks, casting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, 4 men and 1 supposedly worthless animal prepared to attempt something that would either recover $15,000 in stolen army gold or get them all killed in the process. Down in Copper Falls, Amos Breckett sat staring at his wife's secret map, beginning to understand that the trade he'd made might have been the most important decision of his life, not just for himself, but for people he'd never meet, whose survival might depend on the knowledge that Martha had sewn into cloth and the animal that somehow carried those secrets in her memory. The mountain air was growing cold as night approached, and somewhere in the gathering shadows, the most dangerous game of the frontier was about to begin. The broken compass lay half-buried in loose shale, its brass case dented and its needle spinning uselessly. Silas picked it up and examined it by the fading light, noting the initials J.C. scratched into the metal. Jake Carmichael's personal navigation tool, abandoned when the gang had made their hasty ascent to the hidden camp. "They're not as careful as they think they are," Morrison observed, watching Silas pocket the broken instrument. "Leaving a trail like this." "Or they want us to follow it," Silas replied grimly. The more he learned about the Carmichael operation, the more he suspected they were dealing with men who thought several moves ahead. The broken compass might be genuine carelessness, or it might be deliberate misdirection. The hidden path Penny had revealed was even more treacherous than it had appeared from above. They descended single file in the gathering dusk, leading their horses on foot through passages so narrow that stirrups scraped against rock walls. Twice they had to backtrack, when the trail seemed to disappear entirely, trusting Penny's instincts to find footholds that human eyes couldn't detect. The donkey moved with absolute confidence through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. More than once, Silas found himself wondering about the training that had produced such sure-footedness. Military pack animals were taught to navigate difficult ground, but Penny's skills went beyond simple conditioning. She moved like an animal that had spent years learning to survive in places where a single misstep meant death. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered as they negotiated a particularly exposed section where the path clung to the cliff face, with only darkness yawning below. "How does she know where to put her feet?" Silas was beginning to understand that the question wasn't how Penny knew these paths, but who had taught them to her. Someone had spent considerable time and effort training this animal to move through the most dangerous terrain in the territory, and that someone had possessed skills that went far beyond ordinary horsemanship. As they descended, the sounds from the outlaw camp grew clearer. Voices carried on the thin mountain air, along with the occasional snort of a horse or the clink of metal on metal. But there was something wrong with the rhythm of those sounds, too regular, too deliberate, as if the outlaws were performing for an audience they knew was listening. "They know we're here," Silas said quietly, stopping the column with a raised hand. Morrison frowned. "How can you tell?" "Listen to them. Normal conversation doesn't sound like that. They're talking loud enough for us to hear, and they're staying near the fire when they should be posting sentries. It's theater." Even as he spoke, Penny's ears swiveled toward a different section of the cliff, and she took 3 steps sideways before freezing completely. Silas followed her gaze and caught the faint glint of metal among the rocks, a rifle barrel, positioned to cover the exact route they'd been following. "Ambush," he breathed, drawing his own weapon. The shot came an instant later, the muzzle flash lighting up the rocks like lightning. The bullet whined off stone inches from where Morrison's head had been, sending fragments of shattered rock cascading into the darkness below. "Down!" Silas shouted, pushing Hayes behind a boulder as more shots erupted from concealed positions around the camp. The outlaws had known about the hidden path all along, had been waiting for someone foolish enough to use it. But Penny was already moving, leading them away from the kill zone with the same sure instincts that had brought them this far. She found another route, this one so concealed that even Silas couldn't see where it led until they were already committed to it. The shooting continued behind them, muzzle flashes stabbing through the darkness as the outlaws fired at shadows and echoes. "Where the hell is she taking us?" Rodriguez gasped as they squeezed through a gap between 2 massive boulders. "Away from the guns," Silas said, which was answer enough for the moment. The new path led them in a wide circle around the outlaw camp, bringing them eventually to a position where they could see the entire layout without being exposed to hostile fire. From this vantage point, it became clear that the Carmichaels had chosen their ground well. The natural amphitheater was a fortress with only 2 ways in and excellent fields of fire covering both approaches. "Professional," Morrison said grudgingly, studying the tactical situation. "These boys know their business." Silas was thinking about the broken compass and the deliberate nature of the ambush. The outlaws weren't just skilled, they were experienced at this specific type of operation. This wasn't their first time using this hideout, and it probably wasn't their first time dealing with army pursuit. "We need to reconsider our approach," he said. "These men have been planning for this kind of situation." As if to prove his point, the sounds from the camp changed again. The theatrical conversation stopped, replaced by the efficient movements of men breaking camp under orders. Within minutes, the outlaws had their horses saddled and the stolen gold loaded onto pack animals. "They're moving," Hayes observed unnecessarily. "Question is, where?" Morrison studied the terrain through his field glasses, trying to anticipate the gang's next move. Penny provided the answer by walking to yet another concealed trail, this one leading higher up the mountain toward passes that would eventually connect with the main trade routes. She stood at the trailhead, looking back at the humans with an expression that seemed to say, "Well, Are you coming or not? She knows where they're going, Silas said, with certainty. How can a donkey know that? Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with exhaustion and stress. Silas didn't answer immediately, but he was remembering Martha Brackett's cloth map and the annotations she'd made. If his theory was correct, Penny didn't just know these trails. She knew the entire network of hidden routes that connected the outlaw camps throughout the territory. The question that was beginning to haunt him was, what had Martha's connection to the Carmichael gang been, and how had she come to possess an animal with such specialized knowledge? As they prepared to follow the gang's escape route, Silas found himself thinking about Amos Brackett, alone in his farmhouse, with his grief and his empty bottle. The man had traded away something he thought was worthless, not knowing that he was giving up the key to secrets that could make the difference between life and death in the mountains. "We need to stay well back," Silas warned as they began the ascent. "These men have shown they're willing to sacrifice tactical advantage to eliminate pursuit. They'll have rear guards posted, and they won't hesitate to kill." The mountain night was cold and clear, with stars bright enough to cast shadows. Somewhere ahead of them, 7 dangerous men were moving stolen army gold toward a destination that probably offered even better defensive positions than the camp they'd abandoned. Behind them, the territory stretched away toward distant settlements, where families waited for news of whether their men would be paid, whether there would be food on the table when winter came in earnest. Penny picked her way carefully up the treacherous trail, her small hooves finding purchase on ground that seemed to offer none. In the distance, the faint sound of shod horses on rock told them they were on the right track, following men who had killed 4 soldiers and stolen the hope of 200 families. As they climbed higher into the darkness, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that this pursuit was about more than recovering stolen gold. Martha Brackett's secrets were wrapped up in these mountains, and whatever truth lay at the heart of her hidden past might prove to be the key to understanding not just who the Carmichaels were, but how they could be stopped. The broken compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, a reminder that in this deadly game of pursuit through the mountains, the normal rules of navigation no longer applied. They were depending on an animal whose knowledge came from sources that none of them fully understood, following men whose capabilities they had seriously underestimated. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the Carmichael gang moved toward their next stronghold, confident in their knowledge of the terrain and their ability to eliminate anyone foolish enough to follow them into the high country, where winter was already beginning to claim the peaks. Martha's diary lay open on the kitchen table where Amos had dropped it after reading the first few entries, his hands shaking too badly to hold the leather-bound book steady. The elegant handwriting he'd known so well told a story that shattered everything he'd believed about the woman he'd married. May 15th, 1874, 1920. Jake says the Carson City job should be our last big score. Tom's getting careless, and the territorial marshals are asking too many questions. I've been thinking about what comes after. Maybe settling down somewhere quiet, finding a man who doesn't know what I used to be. June 3rd, 1874, 16 found the perfect place. Little town called Copper Falls, good farming country, far enough from the old routes that nobody asks questions. There's a man there, Amos Brackett, lost his first wife to fever. He's got kind eyes and gentle hands. Maybe it's time to stop running. June 20th, 1874, S. told Jake and Tom, I'm done. They don't like it, but they won't stop me. I know too much about their operations for them to risk making an enemy of me. Taking Penny with me. That old donkey knows every trail in this territory, and if the boys ever come looking for trouble, she might be the only warning I get. Amos set the diary aside and reached for the coffee tin where he kept his emergency whiskey, then stopped himself. The revelation that his beloved Martha had once ridden with the most dangerous outlaw gang in the territory demanded a clear head, not the comfortable blur of alcohol. The woman who had come to his farm 7 years ago, claiming to be a widow seeking a fresh start, had been Martha Kellerman, one of the most wanted criminals in 3 territories. The gentle hands that had tended his garden and mended his clothes had once helped rob stagecoaches and army payrolls. The lips that had kissed him good morning for 5 years had once planned raids that left men dead in the dust. But as he continued reading, another picture emerged. That of a woman desperately trying to escape a life that had trapped her since childhood. Martha had been orphaned at 12 and taken in by Jake Carmichael, who'd been barely 18 himself and already building the gang that would terrorize the frontier for years to come. She'd learned to shoot and ride and plan operations because survival in that world demanded such skills, but she'd never stopped dreaming of something different. July 4th, 1874. Married Amos today in the little church in Copper Falls. He's a good man, better than I deserve. I pray God forgives me for the deception, but I can't tell him the truth. It would destroy him, and it might bring danger to this peaceful place. Some secrets are better buried. August 12th, 1874. Penny seems to be adjusting to farm life, though she still gets restless when the wind comes from the north. That's the direction of the old hideouts. Sometimes I catch her standing perfectly still, listening to sounds only she can hear. I wonder if she misses the excitement as much as I feared I would. The entries continued for 3 years, chronicling Martha's struggle to become the woman she wanted to be, rather than the woman she'd been forced to become. She'd learned to cook and sew and tend a garden, skills that came hard after years of living rough in the mountains. But gradually, the entries showed her finding peace in domestic life, discovering joys she'd never imagined in the simple pleasure of waking up beside a man who loved her. September 3rd, 1877, September. Amos asked me today about children. I had to turn away so he wouldn't see the tears. How can I tell him that I've done things that disqualify me from bringing innocent life into this world? Some stains don't wash out, no matter how much you want them to. October 10th, 1877, 9. Found tracks near the north pasture today. Shod horses, 3 riders, moving carefully to avoid leaving sign. Penny smelled them before I saw the tracks. She remembers. After all these years of peaceful farm life, she still remembers what those smells mean. I've hidden this diary, and the map where Amos will never think to look. If something happens to me, maybe someday he'll understand. The final entries, written in the months before Martha's death, showed increasing anxiety about rumors of gang activity in the territory. She'd heard through the gossip networks that connected even the most isolated communities that the Carmichael brothers were operating closer to Copper Falls than they had in years. March 15th, 1878, Henderson's place, was hit last week. Official word is that it was Apaches, but I know better. Jake always said the best way to throw off pursuit was to make it look like Indian work. If they're this close, it means they're planning something big. March 20th, 1878, AP fevers, getting worse. Amos wants to send for the doctor, but I'm afraid of what I might say in delirium. There are things locked in my mind that could destroy everything we've built here. If I don't survive this, I pray God watches over Amos and keeps him safe from the world I brought to his doorstep. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Martha's death. March 20th, 1878. Made my peace with God as best I can. Told Penny goodbye. She understands more than people think. If the fever takes me, she'll watch over Amos in her own way. That old donkey has kept more secrets than any human ever could. Amos closed the diary and sat in the gathering dusk, feeling as if the foundation of his life had shifted beneath him. The woman he'd mourned for 3 years had been a stranger, yet she'd also been exactly who she'd seemed to be, a person trying to build something good from the wreckage of a damaged past. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the farmhouse. carrying scents from the mountains where Silas and Penny were following a trail that Martha had helped create years before her transformation into a farmer's wife. Somewhere in those peaks, the past was catching up with the present in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Meanwhile, in the high country above, Silas crouched behind a wind-carved boulder and watched the Carmichael gang make camp in another natural fortress. This one was even more formidable than the last, a cirque carved by ancient glaciers, with walls too steep to climb and only one way in or out. "They're not planning to run anymore," Morrison observed, studying the outlaws' methodical preparations. "They're getting ready to make a stand." Penny stood at Silas's shoulder, her attention focused not on the gang below, but on something further up the mountain. Her ears were pricked forward, and there was a tension in her posture that spoke of recognition rather than simple alertness. "What is it, girl?" Silas asked quietly. The donkey took several steps toward what appeared to be solid cliff face, then stopped and looked back at him with an expression that seemed almost urgent. Following her, Silas discovered yet another hidden trail, this one marked by scratches in the rock that looked like they'd been made by horseshoes and hobnailed boots. Old marks. Very old. As understanding dawned, Silas realized that they weren't just following the Carmichael gang toward their destination. They were retracing routes that the outlaws had used for years, paths that had been traveled so often that even the rocks bore scars of their passage. And Penny remembered every step of the way. The mountain night was growing colder, with the promise of early snow in the sharp bite of the wind. Somewhere below them, 7 dangerous men settled in to wait for dawn, confident in their defensive position and their knowledge of the terrain. What they didn't know was that their own past was climbing toward them through the darkness, carried in the memory of an animal they'd probably forgotten, guided by secrets that a dead woman had sewn into cloth and written in a diary that her grieving husband was only now beginning to understand. The final confrontation was approaching, and it would be fought on ground that held more history than any of the participants realized. The photograph fell from between the pages of Martha's diary, like a ghost materializing from the past. Amos picked it up with trembling fingers, holding it toward the lamplight to make out the faded image. 5 people stood in front of what looked like a mountain cabin, their poses casual, but their eyes alert with the wariness of people who lived outside the law. Martha stood second from the left, younger than Amos had ever seen her, wearing men's clothing and a gun belt, with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to use the weapons she carried. Her hair was shorter then, tucked under a hat that couldn't quite hide the determined set of her jaw. But it was unmistakably his wife, the woman he'd thought he knew completely. The 3 men in the photograph were clearly the Carmichael brothers, Jake, Tom, and the youngest one, Ben, who'd been killed in a shootout with Texas Rangers 2 years before Martha came to Copper Falls. They stood with the relaxed familiarity of family, which Amos supposed they were, in the way that outlaws become family when blood relatives are all they can trust. But it was the 5th figure that made Amos's hands shake as he held the photograph. Standing next to Martha, her hand resting on the donkey's neck, was Penny Younger, but unmistakably the same animal, with the same intelligent eyes and alert posture that had characterized her even in her supposed decline on his farm. The photograph was dated 1873, which meant it had been taken only a year before Martha arrived in Copper Falls. The implications were staggering. Not only had his wife been part of the Carmichael gang, but Penny had been their animal, trained and conditioned for the specific demands of outlaw life in the mountains. 20 miles away, Amos's revelation was playing out in real time as Silas crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the gang below prepare for what they clearly expected to be their final stand. The tactical situation had become clear during the long night of observation. The Carmichaels weren't just hiding in the mountain cirque, they were fortifying it. Using tools they'd obviously cached there long ago, the outlaws had constructed barriers from loose rock, creating firing positions that would allow them to hold off a much larger force. They'd positioned their horses in a sheltered area where the animals would be protected from gunfire, and they'd arranged their supplies with the methodical care of men who expected a siege. "They've done this before," Morrison whispered, studying the scene through his field glasses. "This isn't desperate improvisation, it's a planned defensive position." Silas nodded grimly. Everything about the gang's behavior suggested that this cirque was more than just a temporary hideout. It was a fortress they'd prepared over years, stocked with weapons and supplies for exactly this kind of situation. "How many men do you think they could hold off from a position like that?" Hayes asked, his young face pale in the starlight. "Depends on how long they're willing to wait," Silas replied. "They've got water from the spring, enough food for weeks, and ammunition cached in those rock shelters. If they're patient, they could pin down a whole company of cavalry." But Penny was showing them something different. The donkey had spent the night exploring areas of the cirque that seemed inaccessible from their vantage point, always staying hidden, but somehow mapping the entire defensive position. Now she stood at the edge of yet another concealed trail, this one leading to what appeared to be the back wall of the natural amphitheater. "There's another way in," Silas said with growing certainty. "She knows something we don't." Following Penny through the darkness, Silas discovered that the back wall of the cirque wasn't as solid as it appeared. Hidden behind fallen boulders and scrub vegetation was a narrow chimney in the rock, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but offering a route that would bring them up inside the outlaws' defensive perimeter. "Jesus," Rodriguez breathed when Silas showed them the hidden passage. How did she know about this? The answer came to Silas with the force of revelation as he remembered Martha Brackett's mysterious past and Penny's uncanny knowledge of outlaw trails. The donkey didn't just know about the secret entrance, she'd probably used it before, in the years when she'd been part of the Carmichael operation. "She used to live here," he said quietly. "This was her home." The implications were staggering. If Penny had been part of the gang, then Martha Brackett's arrival in Copper Falls wasn't the beginning of a new life. It was an escape from an old one. The gentle farm wife who'd captured Amos's heart had once been an outlaw, and the useless donkey she'd brought with her was a living repository of the gang's most closely guarded secrets. As dawn approached, painting the eastern peaks with the first pale light of morning, Silas found himself reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the situation. The Carmichael gang wasn't just a group of outlaws who'd stolen an army payroll. They were men who'd once trusted Martha Brackett with their lives, and she'd betrayed that trust by leaving them for a different kind of life. "What are you thinking?" Morrison asked, noting the change in Silas's expression. "I'm thinking we're in the middle of something that started long before yesterday's robbery," Silas said, "and I'm thinking that donkey might be the key to ending it." The plan that began to form in his mind was risky to the point of foolishness, depending as it did on assumptions about Penny's past that he couldn't verify. But as he watched the donkey position herself at the entrance to the hidden passage, her body language radiating a confidence that spoke of intimate familiarity with the terrain, he began to believe that Martha Brackett's final gift to her husband might be the knowledge needed to bring justice to the men she'd once called family. In Copper Falls, Amos sat staring at the photograph as the sun rose over his failing farm, understanding for the first time that his wife's death hadn't just taken away the woman he loved, it had removed the only person who truly understood the danger that still lurked in the mountains, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they believed was theirs. The stolen army payroll was just the beginning. The Carmichael gang had unfinished business with Martha Brackett, and sooner or later that business would lead them back to the quiet farm, where she'd tried to build a different kind of life. But first, they had to survive the confrontation that was building in the mountain cirque. where 4 men and 1 donkey were about to attempt something that would either recover $15,000 in stolen gold or get them all killed by the most dangerous outlaws in the territory. As the morning light strengthened and the mountain air filled with the promise of violence, Silas checked his weapons one final time and prepared to trust his life to the memories of an animal whose loyalty had once belonged to the very men they were hunting. The past was about to collide with the present in ways that none of them could have anticipated, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of the stolen payroll, but the final chapter in Martha Brackett's long journey from outlaw to farm wife to the secrets she'd carried to her grave. The hidden cash that Penny led them to was Martha's final insurance policy, concealed in a natural cave that had been carved by centuries of wind and water erosion. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas and carefully arranged to stay dry, were enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a small army. "Sweet Mother of God," Morrison breathed as Silas unwrapped the first bundle. Where did all this come from? The answer lay in the methodical way the supplies had been organized. This wasn't a random collection of weapons. It was a carefully planned arsenal, assembled by someone who understood military tactics and the specific challenges of mountain warfare. There were rifles with scoped sights for long-range work, shotguns for close quarters, and enough ammunition to sustain a prolonged engagement. But what caught Silas's attention were the personal items scattered among the weapons. A woman's riding gloves, worn but well-maintained, a silver locket that contained a miniature portrait of a young couple, Martha and Amos, on their wedding day, and wrapped in a piece of silk that had once been part of a dress, a detailed map of the cirque below, annotated in Martha's careful handwriting with notes about defensive positions, escape routes, and the location of supply caches. She was planning for this day, Silas said quietly, studying the map. She knew that sooner or later her past would catch up with her, and she wanted to be ready. The annotations on Martha's map told a story of someone who understood the Carmichael gang's strengths and weaknesses with intimate detail. She'd marked the positions where sentries would be posted, the blind spots in their defensive arrangements, and most importantly, the locations where the gang stored their emergency supplies. "According to this," Silas said, pointing to a symbol on the map, "they've got a powder magazine in that cave on the north wall. Enough explosives to bring down half the mountain if it goes up." Hayes studied the map with the intensity of a man whose life might depend on understanding every detail. "She's marked 3 different escape routes. Looks like they can get out even if we block the main entrance." "Not if we control the high ground," Morrison said, his soldiers' training asserting itself as he studied the tactical situation. "We use the hidden entrance to get behind them, then signal the main force to attack from the front." Classic pincer movement. But Silas was thinking about something else, the personal items in Martha's cache, and what they revealed about her state of mind in the final months of her life. The locket suggested she'd made peace with her choice to leave the outlaw life behind, but the presence of the weapons and detailed maps indicated she'd never stopped worrying about the consequences of that choice. "There's something else," he said, examining a folded piece of paper that had been wrapped with the locket. A letter addressed to Amos. The letter was in Martha's handwriting, but it had never been sealed or delivered. "My dearest Amos, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and my past has finally caught up with our present. I know this will be hard to understand, but everything I told you about my life before we met was a lie designed to protect both of us from the truth. I was Martha Kellerman before I became Martha Brackett, and for 8 years I rode with the Carmichael gang as they robbed and killed their way across 3 territories. I was not an innocent victim caught up in their crimes. I was a willing participant who helped plan their operations and shared in their profits. But I was also a woman trapped by circumstances beyond my control, trying to survive in a world that offered few choices to someone in my position. When I met you, I saw a chance for redemption, an opportunity to become the person I'd always dreamed of being instead of the person I'd been forced to become. The 5 years we spent together were the happiest of my life, and I want you to know that every moment of love I showed you was genuine. You taught me what it meant to be truly loved, and through your love, I learned to forgive myself for the things I'd done. If Jake and his brothers have come for me, it's because they believe I betrayed them by choosing a different life. In their world, loyalty is everything, and leaving the gang is the ultimate betrayal. They will not rest until they feel that betrayal has been answered. I've left supplies and information that might help you defend yourself, but my greatest hope is that you will take Penny and leave this place before they arrive. She knows all their secrets, all their hideouts, all their weaknesses. In the right hands, that knowledge could end their reign of terror forever. I love you more than words can express, and I'm sorry for bringing this danger to your peaceful world. Forever yours, Martha. Silas folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. The woman who'd written those words had been preparing for a confrontation that she hadn't lived to see, but she'd left behind everything needed to finish what she'd started when she chose love over loyalty 8 years ago. "We need to move fast," Morrison said, checking his weapons. "The gang's starting to stir down there, and once they're fully awake, they'll post sentries that'll make this approach impossible." Penny had positioned herself at the entrance to the hidden passage, her body language radiating the same focused intensity that had characterized her behavior throughout their pursuit. But now, there was something different about her, a sense of purpose that seemed to transcend simple animal instinct. "She knows what we're planning," Silas said, watching the donkey's alert posture, "and she approves." The plan they developed was elegantly simple, relying on Martha's detailed knowledge of the gang's habits and defensive positions. Rodriguez would create a diversion at the main entrance, drawing the outlaws' attention, while the others used the hidden passage to approach from behind. The key was timing. They needed to strike before the gang could organize their defense, but not so quickly that they walked into a trap. "Remember," Silas said as they made final preparations, "these men have survived this long because they're professionals. They won't panic, and they won't make stupid mistakes. Our only advantage is surprise, and we'll only get one chance to use it." The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the cirque and creating patches of brilliant light and deep darkness that would either help or hinder their approach. In the outlaw camp below, the Carmichael brothers were beginning their daily routine, unaware that their former associates' knowledge was being used against them. As they prepared to enter the hidden passage, Silas found himself thinking about Amos Breckett, alone on his failing farm with the shattered remnants of his illusions about the woman he'd loved. The man deserved to know the truth about Martha's sacrifice, and if they survived the next hour, Silas intended to make sure he got that chance. But first, they had to recover $15,000 in stolen army gold and bring justice to men who'd killed 4 soldiers and terrorized the frontier for more than a decade. It was the kind of mission that would either make heroes of them all or add their names to the long list of good men who died trying to bring law to the lawless territories. Penny disappeared into the narrow passage first, her sure feet finding holes in the rock that human eyes couldn't detect. Behind her, 4 men followed with weapons ready and hearts pounding, trusting their lives to the knowledge of a woman who died 3 years ago, and the memories of an animal who'd carried her secrets faithfully through years of apparent uselessness. The final confrontation was about to begin, and it would be fought on ground that held more history than any of the participants fully understood. In the balance hung not just the stolen payroll, but the final resolution of Martha Breckett's long journey from outlaw to farm wife to the guardian angel who watched over the men she'd left behind. The cavalry saber had been his father's, carried through 3 wars and polished with the devotion that only a soldier could understand. Silas drew it from its worn leather scabbard as he emerged from the hidden passage, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing memories of lessons learned in blood about honor, duty, and the price of both. "Remember," he whispered to the others, as they positioned themselves behind the natural rock formations that Martha's map had indicated. "We're not just here for the gold. Those men down there killed 4 soldiers doing their duty. This is about justice." The Carmichael gang had spread out across their defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. Jake Carmichael stood near the main entrance, a tall man with graying hair, and the kind of stillness that spoke of absolute confidence in his abilities. His brothers Tom and Bill flanked him, while their 3 associates had taken positions that provided overlapping fields of fire across any approach route. What they hadn't anticipated was an attack from directly above their camp. Silas raised his hand, waiting for Rodriguez to begin the diversion that would draw the outlaws' attention toward the main entrance. The young soldier had volunteered for the most dangerous part of the operation, making enough noise to convince 7 armed men that the main attack was coming from the direction they expected. The first shots echoed across the cirque as Rodriguez opened fire from a concealed position near the entrance, his rifle spitting flame and smoke as he worked the bolt with mechanical precision. The outlaws responded exactly as Martha's notes had predicted, dropping into their prepared positions and returning fire toward the muzzle flashes. "Now," Silas breathed, and dropped into the camp like an avenging angel. The advantage of complete surprise lasted exactly long enough for Silas to reach the first outlaw, a bearded man who'd been concentrating so intently on the gunfire from the entrance that he never saw death approaching from above. The cavalry saber took him cleanly, a soldier's stroke that ended the threat without unnecessary suffering. Morrison and Hayes followed an instant later, their army training evident in the way they moved through the camp with deadly purpose. But the Carmichael brothers were professionals too, and once the initial shock wore off, they began to fight back with the skill that had kept them alive for more than a decade. "Behind you!" Hayes shouted, and Silas spun to find Tom Carmichael raising a shotgun with the kind of deliberate aim that promised certain death. The saber moved before conscious thought could intervene, a fluid motion that turned aside the gun barrel just as it discharged, filling the air with buckshot and thunder. The close-quarters fighting that followed was brutal and decisive. These weren't men who fought for sport or glory, they fought for survival, and they fought with the accumulated skill of years spent in situations where the smallest mistake meant death. Jake Carmichael proved to be everything his reputation suggested: fast, accurate, and utterly ruthless. His pistol spoke twice in rapid succession, and both shots came close enough to Silas to burn powder across his cheek. But the outlaw leader had made the mistake of focusing on the immediate threat while forgetting about the broader tactical situation. Penny appeared behind him like a ghost from his own past, moving with the silent efficiency that had once made her invaluable to the gang's operations. But instead of serving their interests, she was now working against them, using her intimate knowledge of their habits and blind spots to devastating effect. The donkey's small hooves struck Jake Carmichael behind the knees with the precision of a calculated attack, sending him sprawling across the rocky ground just as his third shot went wide. Before he could recover, Morrison was there with his service revolver, ending the career of the most wanted man in 3 territories. "The gold!" Hayes shouted over the continuing gunfire. "Where's the payroll?" But Silas was already moving toward the supply cache that Martha's map had identified, following Penny's lead as she navigated through the chaos of the firefight with the sure knowledge of an animal who'd helped establish this camp years ago. The wooden chests were exactly where the map had indicated, stacked in a natural shelter that would protect them from both weather and casual discovery. $15,000 in gold coins, still bearing the stamps that identified them as U.S. Army payroll. Enough money to feed and clothe 200 families through the coming winter, restored to its rightful purpose by the sacrifice of good men and the betrayal of old loyalties. "We've got it," Silas called, shouldering one of the heavy chests. "Now we need to get out of here before—" The explosion that cut off his words came from the direction of the powder magazine that Martha had marked on her map. One of the dying outlaws had triggered the charges in a final act of spite, bringing down part of the cirque's north wall in a cascade of rock and dust that blocked one of the escape routes. "This way!" Morrison shouted, leading them toward the hidden passage that had brought them into the camp. But the explosion had destabilized the entire rock formation, and what had been a narrow but passable route was now a death trap of loose stone and crumbling handholds. Penny solved the problem with the same instinctive intelligence that had guided them throughout the pursuit. Instead of trying to navigate the collapsing passage, she led them to yet another route, a trail so well concealed that even Martha's map hadn't included it. Probably because it had been the gang's ultimate emergency exit, known only to the inner circle. The ascent from the cirque was harrowing, made more difficult by the weight of the gold chests and the need to move quickly before any surviving outlaws could organize pursuit. But Penny's knowledge of the terrain proved as reliable as ever, and within an hour they had reached high ground where they could rest and assess their situation. "Is everyone accounted for?" Morrison asked, checking his men with the automatic concern of a non-commissioned officer who'd learned to count heads after every engagement. "Rodriguez took a bullet in the shoulder," Hayes reported, "but he'll live. The outlaws weren't so lucky." Silas was studying the cirque below through Morrison's field glasses, looking for signs of movement among the smoke and debris. "I count 4 bodies," he said finally, "but there were 7 men in that camp." The implication was clear. 3 members of the Carmichael gang had escaped the destruction of their mountain fortress, probably using escape routes that even Martha's detailed knowledge hadn't encompassed. They would be wounded, angry, and desperate, which made them more dangerous than ever. "They'll be heading for one of their other hideouts," Morrison said, following Silas's reasoning. "Question is, which direction?" Penny provided the answer by turning toward the southeast, her attention focused on distant peaks that would eventually lead back toward the settled areas of the territory. Her ears were pricked forward with the alertness that had become familiar. But now there was something different about her posture, a sense of urgency that suggested the pursuit wasn't over. "They're not running," Silas said with growing certainty. "They're regrouping." The recovered payroll represented a victory, but it wasn't the end of the story. Somewhere in the mountains, 3 of the most dangerous men in the territory were planning their revenge, and that revenge would eventually lead them back to the quiet farm where Martha Breckett had tried to build a different kind of life. As they prepared to begin the journey back to Copper Falls, Silas found himself thinking about Amos Breckett and the revelations that awaited him. The man deserved to know the truth about his wife's past, but he also deserved to understand the magnitude of her sacrifice and the danger that might still be approaching his peaceful world. The first part of Martha's legacy had been fulfilled, the payroll was recovered, and justice had been served. But the second part, the protection of the man she'd loved enough to abandon her old life for, remained to be completed. And that completion would require everything that Silas, Penny, and perhaps even Amos himself could bring to bear against men who had nothing left to lose, and every reason to seek revenge against the woman who'd betrayed them, even if that woman was 3 years dead. The army payroll chest sat in the middle of Amos Breckett's kitchen table, like an accusation, its brass corners gleaming in the lamplight, as Silas finished explaining everything that had happened in the mountains. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows with increasing force, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of an early winter. "So Martha was one of them," Amos said quietly, his voice carrying neither surprise nor condemnation. "All those years, and I never suspected. She loved you," Silas said, offering Martha's undelivered letter. "Whatever she'd been before, what she became with you was real." Amos read the letter slowly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he absorbed the final words his wife had meant for him to have. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it beside the photograph that had started his journey toward understanding. 3 of them got away," Silas continued. "Bill Carmichael and 2 others. They're wounded and desperate, which makes them unpredictable. And you think they'll come here? It wasn't a question. Martha was the one who knew all their secrets. In their minds, she betrayed them by leaving the gang and taking that knowledge with her. They'll want to settle that account, even if she's been dead for 3 years. Penny stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the barn, her posture alert but relaxed in the familiar surroundings of the farm. The long pursuit through the mountains had taken its toll. Her coat was rougher than usual, and there were small cuts on her legs from navigating rocky terrain, but her eyes remained bright with intelligence and purpose. "How long do we have?" Amos asked, checking the loads in his old hunting rifle with movements that spoke of long familiarity with firearms. "Not long. They'll want to strike before word gets out about what happened to their brothers. A few hours, maybe less." The preparations they made were simple but thorough. Silas positioned himself in the barn loft with a clear view of the approaches to the farm, while Amos took cover in the house where he could watch the main road. Penny, after some discussion, was given the freedom to move between positions as her instincts dictated. "She knows them better than we do," Silas had argued, when Amos suggested securing the donkey in the barn. "If anyone can anticipate what they'll do, it's her." The wait stretched through the afternoon and into the evening, with nothing but the wind and the occasional creak of settling timber to break the silence. But as full darkness fell across the farm, Penny's behavior began to change. She moved restlessly between the barn and the house, her ears swiveling toward sounds that human senses couldn't detect. "They're coming," Silas called softly from the loft. 3 riders, moving careful-like through the north pasture. The attack, when it came, was everything Silas had expected from professional outlaws, coordinated, ruthless, and designed to eliminate resistance before it could organize. Bill Carmichael, the youngest and most vicious of the brothers, led the assault with the desperate fury of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left but revenge. The first shots shattered the kitchen windows, sending glass cascading across the floor where Amos crouched behind his overturned table. But Martha's widower was made of sterner stuff than his appearance suggested, and his return fire was both accurate and deadly, dropping one of the attackers before the man could reload. "Amos Breckett," Bill Carmichael's voice carried across the farmyard with the kind of rage that made men do stupid things. "Your whore of a wife cost me my brothers. Come out and face justice like a man." "Justice?" Amos called back, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "You want to talk about justice after murdering 4 soldiers?" The conversation was interrupted by the roar of Silas's rifle from the barn loft, and another of the attackers spun and fell, clutching a shattered shoulder. But Bill Carmichael was too experienced to be drawn into a prolonged firefight against superior positions. Instead, he did what Silas had hoped he wouldn't. He tried to burn them out. The thrown torch landed on the barn roof, and within minutes, flames were licking at the dry timber with hungry enthusiasm. Silas found himself trapped in a loft that was rapidly becoming an inferno, with no way down that didn't involve exposing himself to Carmichael's gun. "Silas!" Amos shouted from the house. "The roof's going to collapse." But salvation came from an unexpected source. Penny appeared at the base of the barn ladder, her intelligent eyes reflecting the flames as she studied the tactical situation with the same analytical approach she'd shown throughout their mountain pursuit. Then, with deliberate intent, she began to bray not the random noise of a frightened animal, but the specific signal that Martha had apparently trained her to give when the gang needed to regroup. The sound had an immediate effect on Bill Carmichael, who stepped into the open without thinking, responding to a signal he'd heard hundreds of times during his outlaw career. It was the mistake Silas had been waiting for, and his rifle spoke with the finality of justice, long delayed. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of flames and the sound of burning timber beginning to give way. Silas dropped from the loft through a gap in the floorboards, landing hard but alive in the barn below. Penny met him at the door, Her mission apparently complete, her loyalty transferred from the gang that had trained her to the people who had shown her a different kind of life. "Is it over?" Amos asked as they stood in the farmyard, watching the barn burn against the starlit sky. "It's over," Silas confirmed, checking the bodies to make sure. "The Carmichael gang is finished." But even as he spoke, Silas was thinking about the future rather than the past. The reward money for the gang would be substantial enough to pay off Amos's debts and give him a fresh start. More importantly, the truth about Martha's sacrifice would finally be known, transforming her from a woman who'd died, keeping secrets, into a hero who'd helped bring justice to the frontier. "What happens now?" Amos asked, looking around at the farm that had been his world for 7 years. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to build," Silas said. "Martha gave you the tools, her love, her knowledge, and her companion. What you do with them is up to you." Penny stood between the two men, her head raised to catch the scents carried on the night wind. The flames from the burning barn cast dancing shadows across her coat, but her eyes reflected something deeper than firelight, the satisfaction of a job well done and loyalty, finally, completely repaid. The payroll chest sat secure in the farmhouse, ready to be returned to the families who needed it. The outlaws who'd terrorized the territory for more than a decade were dead or captured. And in a small farmhouse in Montana Territory, 2 men and 1 remarkable donkey prepared to face a future that had been bought with courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that transcends the boundaries between species. The wind was rising, carrying the promise of snow and the clean scent of winter approaching. But for the first time in 3 years, Amos Breckett faced that future without fear, supported by friends he'd never expected to find, and secrets that had finally been transformed from burdens into blessings. The new deed to the farm bore Amos Breckett's name in clear, official script, but it had been purchased with money that represented much more than mere financial transaction. The reward for bringing down the Carmichael gang, combined with the bounties that had accumulated over years of their crimes, amounted to enough to not only save the farm, but to rebuild it into something that would have made Martha proud. 3 months had passed since the night of fire and gunshots that had ended the reign of the territory's most dangerous outlaws. Winter had settled over Copper Falls with unusual gentleness, as if nature itself approved of the peace that had come to the mountains. The new barn stood where the old one had burned, built with the help of neighbors who had come to understand that Amos Breckett was a different man than the broken drunk they'd written off after his wife's death. "She looks good in harness," Thomas Ainsworth observed, watching Penny pull a small sledge loaded with supplies from town. The donkey moved with the same sure-footed confidence she'd shown in the mountains, but now her alertness was directed toward the practical concerns of farm life rather than the deadly games of outlaws and lawmen. "Martha always said she was special," Amos replied, accepting the compliment with the quiet pride of a man who had learned to see value where others saw only the ordinary. "Took me a while to understand what she meant." The transformation in Copper Falls had been gradual but unmistakable. Word of the mountain battle had spread throughout the territory, carried by soldiers and settlers who understood that something significant had shifted in the balance between law and chaos. The elimination of the Carmichael gang had removed a shadow that had darkened the frontier for more than a decade, and people moved with the lighter step of those who no longer needed to watch the horizon for approaching danger. Silas Kearney had stayed through the winter, helping Amos rebuild not just the physical structures of the farm, but the routines and rhythms of a life worth living. The quiet cowboy had revealed skills that went far beyond tracking and gunfighting. He understood livestock, crop rotation, and the 1,000 small details that separated successful farming from mere subsistence. "You planning to stay permanent?" Amos asked one evening as they sat by the fire, watching snow fall past the windows of the rebuilt farmhouse. "Thinking about it," Silas admitted. "A man gets tired of moving after a while, starts to see the value in putting down roots." The conversation was interrupted by Penny's distinctive bray from the barn. Not the alert signal she'd used during their dangerous days in the mountains, but the contented sound of an animal secure in her home and purpose. She had adapted to farm life with the same intelligence she'd once applied to outlaw trails, becoming not just a working animal but a guardian whose presence ensured that the peace they'd fought for would be maintained. The letters from Fort Patterson had arrived weekly through the winter, bringing news of the families whose lives had been saved by the recovery of the payroll. Sergeant Morrison had been promoted and reassigned to a post where his experience with mountain warfare would be valuable in training new recruits. Corporals Hayes and Rodriguez had been commended for their courage and offered opportunities for advancement that would take them far from the frontier territories. But it was the letter from an unexpected source that had moved Amos most deeply. Mrs. Eleanor Morrison, the sergeant's wife, had written to thank him for his role in recovering the money that would feed her children through the winter. Her words were simple but profound. "I don't pretend to understand all that happened in those mountains, but I know that my husband came home safe, and my children will not go hungry because of what you and your friends did. There are no words sufficient to express a mother's gratitude for such a gift." Similar letters had arrived from other military families, each one a reminder that their mountain adventure had consequences far beyond the immediate drama of pursuit and gunfight. Real people, wives, children, parents had been touched by their actions, saved from hardship by the courage of men, and one remarkable donkey who had chosen justice over loyalty to the past. The spring thaw had brought visitors to the farm, some seeking to hear the story firsthand, others hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary animal whose knowledge had brought down the most wanted gang in 3 territories. Penny endured the attention with dignity, accepting treats and compliments with the same calm intelligence she brought to everything else. "She knows she's famous," Silas observed, watching the donkey pose patiently for a photographer from the territorial newspaper. "She knows she's home," Amos corrected. "Fame doesn't mean much to an animal, but belonging does." The words carried weight beyond their immediate context. All 3 of them, man, and donkey, had found something in this peaceful valley that had been missing from their lives. For Amos, it was redemption from the grief that had nearly destroyed him. For Silas, it was the stability that comes from having a place and people worth defending. For Penny, it was the completion of a journey that had taken her from the violent uncertainties of outlaw life through the comfortable neglect of assumed uselessness to the honored position of protector and friend. The evening sun cast long shadows across the rebuilt farm as Amos and Silas finished the day's work and prepared for another peaceful night. In the distance, the mountains where they'd fought their battles rose against the sky, no longer threatening but simply beautiful, their peaks touched with gold by the dying light. "You ever wonder what Martha would think of all this?" Silas asked, as they watched Penny graze in the pasture that had been restored to green prosperity. "I think she'd be proud," Amos said quietly. "She spent her life trying to balance the scales for the things she'd done wrong. In the end, she succeeded. The legacy Martha Breckett had left behind was more complex than anyone had imagined. Her knowledge of outlaw ways had helped destroy the gang she'd once served. Her love for a simple farmer had created the stability that made their stand possible, and her faithful companion had proven that redemption was possible even for those whose past seemed to disqualify them from honest living. As darkness settled over Copper Falls and the lights appeared in the windows of the rebuilt farmhouse, 3 friends settled into routines that spoke of permanence and peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, crops to tend, animals to care for, the endless cycle of work that defined farm life. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they had found their place in the world and earned the right to call it home. The worthless donkey that had once seemed like the worst trade in frontier history had become the foundation of a partnership that would be remembered long after the participants were gone. In the end, the most valuable things in life often came disguised as the most ordinary, and it took wisdom to recognize their true worth before it was too late to matter. The wind that had once carried the threat of approaching danger now brought only the sense of growing things and the promise of peaceful tomorrows. And in a small farmhouse in Montana Territory, a man who had learned to see clearly at last prepared to sleep without fear for the first time in years, guarded by friends whose loyalty had been tested in fire and found to be as strong as the mountains themselves.